All right. Nobody pay attention that Tony sat down. It's not a big deal. I had a long weekend. I had 3 preachers staying at my house. My wife's been out of town, so I had to entertain them all by my lonesome. And we've had long days of basically preacher training camp. And so I need a little pep in my step. Any of you at that place? So I'm going to resurrect a song I haven't heard in 15 years in the church. It was common when I was a kid. Anybody heard this? Jesus is a friend next to you. Anybody know that? Okay. It's an interactive song. That's why you have to be standing up. So we're going to sing this together. You got to act it out when the right time comes, and you'll know it. And then we're going to modernize it a little bit and make it for 2018. So we might be bringing it back forevermore. You never know. Jesus is a friend next to you.
Jesus is a friend, so sing along. Jesus is a friend next to you. Jesus is a friend, so sing. Sing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Shake somebody's hand, shake a hand next to you. Shake somebody's hand, sing along. Shake somebody's hand, shake a hand next to you. Shake somebody's hand and sing. Sing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. 2018. Bump somebody's fist, bump a fist next to you. Bump somebody's fist. Bump somebody's fist, bump a fist. Bump somebody's fist and sing. Sing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Give someone a hug, give a hug next to you. Give someone a hug, give a hug next to you. Sing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Give someone a kiss. I'm just kidding.
That might work in 2018. I'm not sure. You may be seated now. All right, it's been a great weekend around here. I know many of you, it wasn't really an event that was geared towards everybody in the church, but a few of you came and participated. But we had 13 preachers, most of them from small congregations. In fact, this was for sure the largest congregation represented, Waterford, but we had congregations of everything from 50 down to about 8 members that their preachers came and enjoyed a weekend of encouragement and being built up. And it was made possible because you in this congregation are trying to be a lighthouse. Through the efforts that you make, some of the ladies made sure we had food to eat. Some of the folks volunteered their home if any of the fellas needed somewhere to stay. And frankly, all the funds that you've given through the years go for events like this. You are a wonderful church. And many of the men said, express to the church our thanks. You know, we just don't have much that's provided for us through the year. So you're helping to improve preachers and affect in a positive way churches. So thank you. Thank you, Waterford Church of Christ. We had Brother Kevin Haynes who came in to do homiletics instruction. That's just a fancy way of saying how to write a sermon. And he did that through the course of the weekend. And then this morning he was a guest speaker in our joint Bible class. Wasn't that a really good class and encouraging? I hope you were excited about that. Next Sunday night at Sunday Night Live, we're going to have another guest speaker. The preacher of the Flatwoods Church of Christ in Flatwoods, Alabama will be here. And he and I will do a joint sermon together. His name is Seth Williams. So he'll be here to preach next Sunday night. He and I are going to do one of those worship and songs that we do on occasion. So he's going to do the preaching, I'll do the singing, and we'll have a father-son tag team. So, all right, tonight we're in Romans chapter 2. And our text again is quite broad. I'm trying to capture the entire context when we're going through some of these sections, and it's a little bit challenging, so we're doing the best we can. But we're going to look basically at chapter 2, verse 12 through chapter 3 and verse 9. And we touched on this section last time as well, but it's a very rich passage where Paul isn't pulling any punches. He's writing to the Hebrew Christians, the Jewish Christians, who are struggling with their relationship with their Gentile believers, particularly because they judge the Gentiles by the fact that they're Gentiles. You know, human beings have always struggled with bigotry and prejudice. And it's been at the heart of so much disunity. And it has always been that way. And regardless of what the social scientists or the philosophers of our age try to envision as a utopia, where through education or through the right social structure or social systems or the right governmental approach or whatever it may be, that we have a world where there's no bigotry and there's no prejudice. The reality is man has always been that way and probably always will be, because that is a byproduct of sinfulness. Because when you don't believe there's a God, then you look out for yourself. And you're worried about what you want. But when you understand that God created man and woman and He made everyone equal, because all of us are nothing but broken shells in our sinfulness without His grace. So how could I ever get an arrogance that I'm better than you for any reason, much less some superficial reason? Like I have dark hair and you have light hair, or in Kevin's case, I still have some hair and he has no hair. You know, or I'm good looking and Don's not, well, never mind. You know, I mean, on a superficial thing, how worldly, how obviously wicked is it that we've had this clear byproduct of sinfulness in the world around us. But the truth is, it seeps into the church. It does. Human beings, in our sinful nature, we have a tendency to not get out of our comfort zones when it comes to, we like to be around people. People like to be around people that are like them, that sound like them, that talk like them, that act like them, and that look like them. And it tends to become a we versus us thing, where they look, and if you're not part of the clique or the group, based upon whatever that clique or group is rooted in, then somehow our tribe is better than your tribe. It's just that innate evil tribalism of humanity. And I say all that because Paul is going to address that here in these Jewish believers. If you want to talk about bigotry and prejudice in the church, read the New Testament. In fact, there's hardly a letter of the New Testament that doesn't address that evil within the ranks of God's people. Because, hey, when you're transformed, as we talked about this morning, it's a little bit hard to make the transformation at times. We're still tempted and pressured by the old man. And so Paul's going to address this and say some very, very straight, very firm things to these Jewish believers to address their bigotry and their prejudice. Just imagine that there's two boats out in a terrible typhoon at sea. One is a barnacle-ridden, just absolutely worn down old whaling ship. And the other is one of these opulent sea liners. You know, with swimming pools and you know, water slides. And bars on the promenade and on every other deck and places where people lay out and enjoy the sun and opulent rooms. Just imagine the difference between those two. But in the typhoon, they both capsize and they both start to sink. Well, which is a better ship? I mean, which one's a better ship? Well, before the storm, someone might say, well, the ocean liner, for sure. But after the storm, they're both just hunks of steel at the bottom of the sea, right? Just imagine two men. One is standing out on the plains of Texas, way in the lowlands, and he's reaching for the stars. And the other one's at the top, at the pinnacle of Mount Everest, and he's reaching for the stars. Which one's closer? Well, there's no doubt which one's closer. But who cares? Which one's going to reach those stars? Neither one. You see, comparisons are foolish. Foolish. When you're comparing the broken versus the, well, really broken. Or the terribly tarnished versus the really terribly tarnished. You know, you don't go to the junkyard and look at two beat up, worn out cars and say, well, this one's way better because the paint's better on it. Because of the fact that they're two beat up, worn out cars. Who cares if one's got a few less dents than the other one does? You get the point, right? But human beings, we do this all the time. We make comparisons between things that the determination shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. And many times, people find their value and their worth in how they measure up to the people around them. And that's like comparing two beat up, worn out, useless cars. Because one's got 48 dents and one's only got 36. And that's what we do. That's what they did. You see, these images illustrate the problem Jewish Christians had. They thought they were better than the Gentile believers. And they thought that because they were better, that gave them some special status. That gave them some advantage with God. You see, pointing out the 48 dents in the other, they began to see their dents as not really dents anymore. The true issue in the Roman church, as it is in almost every first century church, as it is in almost every 21st century church, is prejudice and disunity. Paul addresses these evils by saying a couple things. First of all, chapter 2, verses 12 through about verse 16. For as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. As many of us sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles do not have law, by nature do the things contained in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law unto themselves, who show the works of the law written in their hearts, and their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts, accusing or else excusing them. In the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel, indeed, you are called a Jew and the rest of the law, and make your boast in God. Now he's talking here about a passage that I've heard referenced many, many times in the church, but have heard few explanations in regard to what it means. Because it seems as if the Apostle Paul says there could be those who were justified who never heard of the law, who never heard about it, and they were justified. It seems as if maybe he's saying that. It's because that's exactly what he's saying. And in fact, that has to be the case under the Old Testament system. Now, we have the fullness of Christ that's come now. Yet in the Old Testament, we see some individuals, like for instance, Job. How did Job know how to serve God? You ever wonder that? Was Job a Jew? No. If you have a chronological Bible, Job will appear in about the time of Abraham. By the way, was Abraham a Jew? Was Abraham a child of Abraham? No. Was he an Israelite? Well, his son wasn't born yet, who was known as Israel. So how do we have these people who are servants of God? They don't have the law of Moses. How about this one? Melchizedek. Melchizedek, you remember, was the king of Jerusalem, Salem, and a priest of God. But there was no law. There was no temple or tabernacle for him to go in and offer sacrifices. There was no 10 Commandments for him to encourage the people to follow. This is all way prior to any of that coming about. But yet the Bible says that Abraham, the friend of God, the father of faith, and all faith people, all believers, he gave homage as one who is greater than Abraham to Melchizedek, who was king of Salem, Jerusalem, and priest of Jehovah God. How could that be? How could they have even known what they needed to do? And we might default back to, well, God probably just told them. God spoke to people then. Perhaps. But there's also, Job clearly didn't know exactly what God wanted him to do, because he didn't get direct communication from God, did he? He asked for it all throughout the book. Why? What kind of answer does he get? Well, until he gets the big answer at the end, he's not getting any answers until it's like, okay, you've asked enough. Gird yourself up like a man, and I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And then you have this long section of Job going, okay. You know? But Job didn't have faith in God because God was talking to him. Job knew there was a God because he had eyes. And because he could see the world around him. And the heavens. And the intricacy of creation. Melchizedek knew that there was a one God to serve because he was intuitive. And that's precisely what he's saying here. He says all those under the law, see, people would say, well, what about those who never heard the law? That's not fair that God allowed. Let me be very, very plain about this. We don't have to ever argue that people apart from the law or under the law, what is the reason people are separated from God? You're not separated from God because you either heard the law or didn't hear the law. You're not separated from God because you either hear the gospel or don't hear the gospel. You know, no one will be lost because they heard the gospel or didn't hear the gospel. You know why they'll be lost? Because they sinned. And he's saying there, you notice he says the word conscience. Because there are none, as he says, who are without excuse. So you say, well, what about the fella on the desert island who never hears of Jesus or never hears? And how is that possibly fair if he doesn't even know what's right? I would look at this passage and dare to say that the straw man that we're building by saying that doesn't exist. Because I've never known anyone who never violated their conscience. Have you? Do people who don't know the law or know the scriptures or the instructions of God, do they innately know I shouldn't lie? Yeah. Not lying has been a part of the civic code of every culture in the history of this world. How about I shouldn't murder? How about I shouldn't steal from someone else? Does everybody everywhere, all over this entire globe, from the very first man to the present day, know they shouldn't lie, they shouldn't cheat, they shouldn't steal? Does everybody in every culture know that innately? But how many have never violated what they innately knew to be right? You see, they're not lost because they had the law or didn't have the law. That's how they might be saved, but that's not why they're lost. People won't be lost in this world because they hear the gospel or don't hear the gospel. That's the possible remedy versus not having a remedy. But that's not the source of lostness. People are lost because people are sinners. And regardless of what the social scientists tell us, or the political and social philosophers of our age, or those who would propose a certain governmental system, there is no utopian environment you can put and make where people will never violate what they know to be wrong. Because people are innately selfish. They are. Me too. You too, Don. Woke him up on that. I mean, we are. And my kids, as much as I love them, when they were 2, they were starting to catch the selfish bug, right? And when they're 3, they were fully infected. And when they were 4, we thought there was no return and no remedy, you know? I mean, but what he's saying here is he's saying there's just no excuse. Don't try to find loopholes in all this. Or how dare we give a challenge to God's righteousness when we know how we are? We know how we are. It wouldn't have mattered if I knew what was right or wrong. I still knew some things that were wrong, and I still would have done them. Would you? So we could throw up a straw man all day of what if. Have you ever noticed that people are trying to argue a point, they always argue the most ridiculous, absurd extreme of the point? You know? Somebody's trying to argue, well, I don't know, I'm making up something. Death penalty, pro or against. And they'll say, I don't think people should be put to death because of what about the person? And they'll give this elaborate, incredible circumstance. And I want to say, no, don't put up straw men. Argue the point. And when it comes to biblical things, let's just deal with the reality of the fact that mankind is messed up. And without God, you know what we got in this world? Abuse and war and death. And mamas crying over the graves of their babies. And sons that go off and never come home. Because without God, our species is pitiful indeed. So he says there's just no excuse. The anticipated rebuttal for this is in verses 17 and 18. Indeed, you're called a Jew in the rest of the law, and make your boast in God, and know His will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed in the law. So he knows they're going to say, yeah, but that's not us, because we're His chosen people. We're the Jews. And he says, well, here's my response, 19 through 24. You're confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor to the foolish, a teacher of babes, and having the form of knowledge of truth in the law. You therefore who teach one another, do you teach yourselves? You who preach that a man should not steal. Do you steal? You who say don't commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? His point is very simple. You think you're better than people who disobeyed the law because they didn't even know there was a law when you had a law and you still disobeyed it? He lays them low. He says, how dare you play that comparison game and puff yourself up because I'm a luxury liner. Look at that old useless whaler, when you're both sinking. Because you've both done the same stuff. How dare you say, look how high I've come. Look how much closer I am to the stars than that guy, when neither one of you are ever going to reach it anyway. Don't make comparisons. So they said, we have an advantage because we have the law. He says, no. But then, in chapter 3 and verse 1, he said, what advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way. Chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. So he says, no, having the law doesn't make you better, but it is an advantage because it's a responsibility and it's a privilege. It's a privilege. God has used you to fulfill His purpose. Verse 3 and 4. For what? If some did not believe, will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and you may overcome when you are judged. So he's telling them back in verse 2, much in every way, chiefly because you were committed the oracles of God. They were given the privilege that God's will for how the terrible sickness of sin could be healed. God gave them, who were just as sick as everybody else, He gave them the antidote. And his point is that shouldn't make you proud and make you think you're better. That should make you compassionate. Because all of those folks who are sick with the same thing you are, now you know the cure. You know the cure. You see, there's a distinct humility which is impressed upon us when we realize how pitiful man is without our Lord. And whenever we're tempted to be puffed up with prejudice or bigotry or pride or think that my luxury liner is so nice, look at that whaler. All we have to remember is that without him, we all end up at the same place, at the bottom. Tonight, if you have any need in your life that needs prayers, if you need to be encouraged, uplifted, we want to do that. And maybe there's someone in here who says, I want to let go of my pride. I want to let go of my tendency to compare with everybody and everything. Because the only comparison a Christian needs is the cross. And all it does, the comparison only does one thing. It makes your heart full of gratitude and your eyes tear up, realizing that I'm hopeless, but now I have hope. If you need to come right now as we stand, as we sing.